On our earth, before writing was invented, before the printing press was invented, poetry flourished. That's why we know that poetry is like bread. It should be shared by all, by scholars and by peasants, by all our vast, incredible, extraordinary family of humanity. That was Pablo Neruda, and I'm Bob Holman, and this is the Poetry is Bread podcast, where poetry challenges us, makes us think, and with imagination and courage, changes the world. I'm mostly interested in the devil's story because I know there's some devil in me, says Terrance Hayes in The Kafka Virus Verses, Thursday. The devil being, dear close listeners, is that not for 1 second can Mr. Hayes be anything but a poet, full of linguistic trickery, drollery, tomfoolery, deep magic, bloody politics, full of praise, poems a la the griots, whose hand, when picking up a pencil, not just any pencil, but a Palomino, Blackwing, 530, ponders, shall I write or shall I draw? And a strict, well, maybe, reinforcing his ever-present sense of form and the formal poem after poem, put that hyphen at the end of the line between must and ache. And what do you have? Mustache. Of course, that's the trickster in the mirror who's incessantly changing from mother to son to Gwendolyn Brooks, to Frank Stanford, to G.J. Renegade, to Audre Lorde, to Marlon Brando, to Terrance Hayes. Welcome, Terrance, to the Bowery Poetry Studio.
Hey, Bob. It's good to be here.
Yeah, man. So, listen, we got these new books of yours here on the table, a few other books, too, but there's no place to start like with the poem that you're working on this morning, so... is that a good place to start, do you think?
Yes. I generally say, and, as much as possible, even when I'm doing live readings, trying to share something new, but I generally say last poem and the next poem are the most important poems that you're working on. So that also means, it keeps me vulnerable, makes me sweat a little bit when I'm trying out new stuff. So I'm just going to try to relax and ease into even the devil's story, the notion of story. I'm still just always thinking about that as a Southerner. So let's see. I feel like it's about 6 minutes long, but let's see how we do. The Underground League of Doormen. I lived in a tall building watched by great and motley doormen, seated and standing, coming and going, prior to, amid, and after far and near boredoms, pandemics, and wars, for many years before asking the oldest and most beloved of the doormen why I'd never seen women safeguarding the city's entries. So adored was this particular centenarian century, flowers from the ends of the earth filled the lobby for weeks on end, the last time he traveled down to the great door of the doorman's locker room in the basement, wherefrom laughter and live music occasionally emanated, and wherein one suspected the most cosmopolitan of the clandestine network of doormen met to share gossip, cultural events, letters from members and applicants, art projects, family vacation photos, dreams, tall tales, and poetry. When the oldest and most beloved of the League of Doormen was a small country boy, he visited his grandmother, who lived in the city with a cruel second husband that sometimes exiled him to the basement for no good reason. One day, while playing hide and seek by himself, he stumbled upon a break room of several eclectic doormen who welcomed him into their storytelling time. The first doormen were not men, the oldest and most beloved of the doormen told other doormen repeatedly over many, many years of meetings, holiday parties, reunions, and impromptu gatherings. Each time someone turned off the lights and everyone closed their eyes to hear the story. There were once 4 doors at 4 corners of the city and 4 daughters sworn to watch them. The idea was a visitor to the city would enter one of these doors into a different season. For the villainous, a door opened in winter. For the starved, a door opened in harvest time, for example. The weather depended upon one's disposition. But the 4 daughters complicated these doors. 3 of them, the triplets, were named Ruby, Diamond, and Opal because Jewel, the oldest of the 4, named them herself. Their mother died giving birth to the triplets when Jewel was 5. Their father, formerly nearly undetectable with work, was now invisible with grief. When Jewel was 15 and the girls were 10, she trained them to watch gaps and absences. When Jewel was 20 and her sisters were 15, she taught them how to carpenter using a hatchet and how to turn metal into knobs and hinges. When Jewel was 25, she and her sisters were hired to stand watch over 4 corners inside which the city would be erected. The triplets chose their 3 points just as Jewel arrived at her corner, and a fox sprang from the bushes with a sky blue egg in its mouth. The fox was the color of fire, except for a black foxtail, which Jewel nearly grabbed before the foxtail and the fox changed into a long black snake with the same egg held in its fangs. It had flame-colored eyes that made Jewel jump back. She took out her hatchet, and just as she caught up to the snake, it rose up on its tail and changed into a lanky flamingo with the blue egg held in one of its claws, which made Jewel pause, thinking it might become a phoenix if such a creature was real. And sure enough, she caught the egg in the flamingo's claw as the bird burst into a sprawl of ash. When she turned around with the mysterious egg, she met her 3 sisters' bewildered stares, which grew 3 times more bewildered when Jewel cracked the light blue shell and gulped down the fiery yolk. 4 laughing sisters returned to their posts as the city began to be built, never leaving their doors as the river people came up from the river to live in the city, and the tree people came down from the trees, and the field people came from the 4 corners of the field to put down stakes. Jewel didn't know how to feel at first. She stood like a door trembling in a volatile climate. She grew wooden. Ruby, Diamond, and Opal panicked. Who would take her place? She grew so stiff, she lay down like a trapdoor bulging with dirt flooding from a grave. Consuming the mysterious egg had made her pregnant. She lay swelling until she cracked open. Jewel died at childbirth, just as her mother had died, giving birth to her sisters. Her son was raised by his aunts. When the boy was 5, they trained him to watch the gaps and absences in others. When the boy was 10, they taught him to carpenter and carve his mother's name into wood with her hatchet, how to turn metal into knobs and hinges, how to sleep standing up. This boy became the first doorman. Everywhere men watch the doors, there are women watching the men and watching over them.
Whoa.
That's it.
No, that's not it. I beg to differ. Well, you know, we were talking about storytelling before, and there's one thing to tell a story in the voice, and all your poems tell these stories. But this is a story that is, you know, of the classic epic, it's a children's story, fantasy, fantastic, everything's changing into everything else type of storytelling story. As a matter of fact, I think I've read in one of the poems here where the fox, or is that in the other book, where there's a fox and that turns into which one is that? Do you remember?
I don't know. Well,
oh,
probably,
yeah, of course not. But there
probably.
is. You've started this one a lot of times, I think, maybe, and it's still not ended, you know, because we all know that Jewel cannot be dead no matter what, right. You know. Mm-hmm. But what a beautiful, so, you know, tell us about it. How do you get the urge to get into that world?
Well, you said it in just that little piece you picked out. I'm mostly interested in the devil's story. I mean, you know, these lines that show up like that, those are ideas or things that maybe occur to me over the course of a day walking around. But the thing I am mostly interested in is telling an interesting story. And you know, the devil's story, I'm always more interested in the angel story. You know what I mean? It's got to be just by laws of storytelling. And so, yeah,
that reminds me of Louis Spears in Bible school, who said to the teacher, well, if I have to be in the world with no sin where I have no choice, or the world of sin where I have a choice, Let me ask you one thing. Could I perhaps live in the world without sin during the week and commute with sin for the weekends?
What did Mark Twain say? Go to heaven for comfort and to hell for company. That's what Mark Twain said. If you want company, go to hell.
You quote Twain in your book, Watch Your Language. We got these two books here. I should mention that Ram Devanini is over there slipping our knobs and hinges as the fearless producer with his faders and smarts. So to Speak is a book of poems that includes the breath-stopping poem that I quoted from before the Kafka virus versus Thursday, and Watch Your Language is a visual and literary reflections on a century of American poetry. There's a mouthful. And of course, Mark Twain shows up in that, as do thousands of others. Did you ever think of putting an index in Watch Your Language?
Yeah, it would have taken so long, I did that for the previous prose book on Etheridge. I did a much kind of more thorough thing with that. And with this one, I still think of this thing as just kind of a mess, really. It is seeing how I think about things. There's not always a kind of clear logic about what I'm reflecting on. And that is kind of the word I keep going back to. There are reflections. So yeah, everybody's in it.
Well, it's a collection, among other things, it's a collection of essays that you've written over the years.
Sure. Well, I went and found some of the ones over the years to spread out this idea, to build out this idea of the timeline that's illustrated and at the center of the book. But I think that timeline and the smaller kind of prose pieces about individual poets was really what was driving me a lot of the time. And I'm still going, really, honestly, even if you hear like the kind of allegorical pitch of that prose book and what I just read. Man. I feel like I'm still interested in maybe just telling more of the stories about my peers, actually, my mentees, my young students who are kind of really interested in writing. I think I want to write about them as well.
Absolutely. Because this book, it's in 9 what you call parts, not chapters. I'm interested in that, is parts, as if this were a workbook in grade school for spelling or something. Am I onto it there?
That's right. And then the muse, again, like a kind of a sense of, I kept trying to figure out how to get my timeline and my century to break down around 9, particularly because of just thinking about the 9 muses spread out over a century.
Well, that brings me up to you, the great, trickster Foolarama, because it took me a long time to find out where that footnote comes from there on page 13 or whatever it is.
Right.
And only to find it back there on whatever it is, page 160, where the asterisk is. Is that the kind of... am I passing the exam now, Mr. Hayes?
Here's the thing.
Professor Hayes, pardon me.
The relationship between art and the marketplace. The idea that you would make a paint... there's a poem about this in a book saying, like, if a painter spends a year on a painting, it seems like you should spend at least that much time staring at it if it took that long to build it. So when I think about books across the board, for every book that I encounter, I'm like, well, the first year that you get a book, what do you really know? It's like when you date a person for the first year, what do you really know about that person? You got a general idea that you like them. But in the second or third year, when you revisit this relationship, it just becomes something different, sometimes more valuable, sometimes less. And so I just don't really value a lot of people's immediate responses to, honestly, to anything, to my poems either. I think poems have to be reheard. So when I'm in the audience and I give you one poem and that's it, I'm like, they don't know what I'm talking about because it's too much. And so I think generally about this, in particular a book like this, but everyone's book is what I'm going to say to you again. I just feel like that first year when people are giving those prizes and trotting you out and you're talking in these contexts, like even now about it, it's like, well, who knows really what this thing is? It's going to take a minute, just like anybody's sort of creation. It takes a minute to know. So that's kind of, and I like that position with the work. I don't like to know too much about it, honestly.
Well, you set us up for a traditional educational tutelage here by divvying up most of the chapters, chapter 2 through 7, into the decades. That's how you set up your timeline. I do like the way you put that little black mark up there so that you know how to get from decade to decade. How did that come up? How did that little black mark, like the page you turned to?
Initially, the timeline, I published a version of this timeline in the Hopkins Review, and it was more horizontal. But when I turned it, or when I and the book designers decided to try to turn it to get it to work out, that was something that came up. Another thing that I have said to people sort of in league with wondering what people will get in that, because so much is going on, what do you get in one read? It's like, oh, just look at the pictures. Because I would say to you, I had to shrink a lot of my drawings down to get it in a book, and I still feel like I could have probably just cut this thing in half and just made my pictures bigger, and you would maybe see some of what I'm working with. So I think now in this 2 months the book's been out, I just want to say to people sometimes, just don't read it, just look at the pictures, because they're as significant, but because they're smaller and in that timeline, you might miss some of the stuff, like Sharon Olds sitting at a chair, there's things like that.
Oh, yeah. Well, and it's also what you do when you're a kid. You read by how to learn to read. Look at the pictures.
I agree. That's what I feel like I should have put that more, emphasize that more on maybe.
Well, all you have to do is say it here on the podcast, because everybody hears this.
That's right. Look at the pictures.
Like Shohei Ohtani, the Los Angeles Angels pitcher who hits as well as he pitches, your drawing and your poetry, I'll say your art, your visual art, painting, drawing, it gets to the point, at some point, where you are doing your own covers, all right? So did you decide to do the covers when your drawing progressed to the point where you were ready to put them on the covers? Or was it that your accolades stacked up enough so that you could persuade the publisher into saying, okay, we'll put your drawing on the cover?
Okay, let me see if I can make this a quick answer, because there's so much in there. The first thing is like Paul Slovak, who's getting ready to retire, has been my editor at Penguin for 20 years. He's really, other than Luis Rodriguez, who took my very first book, he's the only editor that I've ever had. And he's pretty much let me do what I want to do. And in fact, as I think about it, I maybe should have said that. In that piece that I started with, I was thinking about him, because I was thinking about like a really good editor kind of being like a doorman. And they're just sort of watching, they're seeing, the readers are kind of walking by and they're letting them come in, but they're keeping you safe to do your work. And, it's something like that about, and that kind of tradition of a certain kind of editor and a certain kind of safeguard so you can have a safe space is maybe gone from. Anyway, so the first thing is that, like, I've had an editor who's let me do what I wanted to do. And so my covers have been on, my paintings have been on all of my books. But the first book I did, the very first book, Muscular Music, I did. And then the book that won to got me with Penguin, with the National Poetry Series, Hip Logic, I also did. This book after that, when Penguin now was interested, because I got with Penguin through that contest, when their people came around me, they said they wanted to do the cover. So they were like, nobody's ever done their own covers. This is like 2006, so this is for Win in the Box. So we had this whole thing. They sent me a cover that I thought was terrible, and I sent them some woodcuts and some other things that they were like, we don't know what to do with this. And then I said, well, if you're a book designer, I can send you a stick man, and you should know what to do. And then I said to Paul, too, so this is my second book with Penguin. I said to him in this question around doing the cover, I was like, well, if y'all covers are terrible, but if they were, and I said, but if you do it, y'all can have it. The book will still sell. Interestingly, I said something to him about this book some 20 years later, which is, you don't need me. Most of your authors are dead. So if I don't want to do anything with the book and stay home and teach and keep writing, you just sell it like you sell all your other dead authors. So I said that about the book, and I was like, and then I'll just go on. So it wasn't an argument specifically about my cover. It was really about their cover sucking. So then I sent them the same image I sent them before, and the woodcut that's on that book was there. And since that second book, they've let me do all of my covers. They've insisted, and I just send them the work, I do a few paintings, and I just let them choose it. For this one, interestingly enough, I had this, for So to Speak, the Marvin Gaye painting. It's the first painting. The reason that all these images are usually looking vaguely like me is because I do like to paint people, and I paint a lot from photographs, which means I run into permissions things. So during COVID, I came across this great painting of Marvin Gaye in a robe. I started the painting. I never finished it, but it was in the file that I sent them when I sent Penguin. I just sent them like 6 pieces of paintings that I've done in between books and say, whatever you want to put on the cover. So, there was that one. There's the profile that's on the cover of Watch Your Language, and there was just Marvin Gaye. And all the other ones were essentially kind of me, manipulations of myself, except for this one. They put it on the cover, they sent it to me mocked up, and I was like, oh man, I did not get permission. So then and my editor's like, oh, you probably want maybe $5,000, So then I ran down the artist, Adrian Boot, who's in the UK, maybe in his 80s now. I think he maybe knew Marvin Gaye.
Yeah.
I said, they've already designed the book. I'll give you whatever you want. I'll send it to you. What do you say? And he said, you can use it. Non gratis? No, he didn't charge me anything. So I've sent him the books then. So anyway, essentially, I've always done my covers.
That's a good one.
They now like to let me do them. They were resistant initially.
You wrote your art, your poems all the way into the big leagues.
Here's the thing, though. Especially, I wonder how you think about this as a person that was married to an artist. The things that I do outside of poetry in terms of drawing I don't even want to bring it up, but people know me, playing the piano, things like that. Anything really that's expressive, I don't actually want to be an expert at it. I don't actually want to be an expert at drawing. I just want to draw. The poetry thing, I teach it, and so there's another kind of thing. But when I'm trying to write, I'm trying to get past that back to just having fun, which is easier for me to do as an artist, where all I know is that, like, if I make a painting, I may give it to someone for Christmas. So I painted everybody in my family, just as a way to keep in shape. I paint myself every now and again because that's just easy. I'm always there. But I don't get into questions of, like, coming up with great images on my own, or all the things that are serious artists is turning this question to you now would do. So I just mostly think of it as a hobby. I don't really even want to put adjectives in front of the kind of painter that I am. And as a teacher, I say that to my poets, like, oh, I don't, good or bad, if you're 80 years old writing poems, that's a good story. I don't care if they're bad poems. I like that you're 80 writing poems. So I hope to be like that in all modes of art, just to be still playing without those adjectives of whether it's good or bad.
Well, I tell you that it's beautiful because what comes through the most in these poems, and you, the poet, is life. How to live, just live in life. Just there's life. What are you going to do? Live. That's enough. All right, do it, But it's not just be. There's also the do, the make part, which you talk about, we know that poetry is... Poesis is to make, but you'd make another Greek reference somewhere in these books about making. I don't know. But what I wanted to say is, when you gave me that drawing for my birthday, somebody stole it. So just remember that. Remember that I don't have that one anymore. Anyway, getting back to our story here, I agree completely, but although, here's where I differ. We can have this one out.
Sure.
Because to me, everything I do is the poem, So, I don't have a second skill, although I do fiddle around with a saxophone and played the bassoon back in the day. But, in other words, I think of filmmaking, which I do with Mr. Rahm over here, as just being, I'm the poet in it. For the United States of Poetry, I was the guy who translated between poetry and film, between Mark Pellington and Czesław Miłosz, when Mark came.
That's one of my very, very favorite video series ever for poetry. Tracy is one of my very best friends, and I that Project Princess, Tracy Morris does other things and is just amazing generally. But when I saw Tracy doing that thing, I knew she was going to be one of my friends, and she is all these years later. But so much of like my journey through poetry, finding that thing. What did it come out? 95? Was it 95?
Yes, 95, 96.
I know a lot about it. Very important. Everybody in that. Yeah, the gift. That's a great poem.
Well, Miłosz didn't really want to do anything because he's Miłosz, and Pellington said to him, "We should take this poem. It should be heard by everybody. This poem. It's just beautiful interior.
A
short
day
poem.
so happy. Yeah.
Oh, well, we got. Let me finish the story, then I'll give the story. The story is, we'll be in a drive-in, and up on the screen comes your poem, and it comes through the speakers where they're there, and the voice, the mezzanine down the streets in the morning. It's going to be your poem, and Miłosz looked at him and said, "That is a terrible idea."
Yeah.
And what we did was we set up the camera at Columbia when he was teaching a class, and he read the poem in Polish and English, and we made it out of that kind of flip between the languages thing.
But look here, this is the thing about me finding something like that just before grad school or into grad school, and thinking this was clearly just made for me, and so I have my favorite relationship to music too, and to art, and I'm definitely putting the United States of Poetry in that category. Was just always feeling like it was just waiting for me. So I was the person who felt therefore that I needed to take the word to everybody else. So everybody that knows me also knows how I feel about that. Best American Poetry Series, same thing with David Lehman, something that I found my freshman year in college. It's like the second poetry book I ever bought was the 1990 edition of that. Same thing. So that meant that I felt like they were given to me to give to others. So the whole, even like making my own videos sometimes, all traces all the way back to things that was happening. What was the brother who was on the bus? L something. It was so hot.
El Aziz.
So many ones. The James Joyce, is that Matt Cook?
Matt Cook in Milwaukee, the Milwaukee School of Poetry.
The other day, and again, think about this. This is not me saying I found this in a book. This is me saying to you, watching that series was the same thing as having read all of those poems, because I carry those lines around. So that the other day, when someone was saying something about Trump, I said, "Oh, Matt says that in that poem. You always get the rulers that you deserve." I think about that line all the time. And
go back with your metric system.
Coming back to me. So yeah, hugely important.
How many times do you think you saw it for this kind of memory?
I watch it all the time. I bought the series. I bought the series when it was on VHS.
Oh my!
I can't remember how much it was, but I bought every video. And then when it got transferred, I think I bought the CDs. I have the book of it, and I just used it for teaching for many, many years. And at this point, the things that still come up: CD Wright, tours, and because it's hard to find a short CD Wright poem when you're trying to turn people on.
Exactly.
That poem does though.
Where a tongue goes where the tooth had
Yeah, that's
been.
right. A boy, like orchid, standing in the corner like an orchid. And that's one that people know. And then, as I said, that Tracy poem is just...
Tracy's
you can't
so
find
fantastic.
a poem like that anywhere else.
Now she's in Iowa.
Yes, she is.
Take
She's
it
teaching
all
that.
the way.
I just saw her on Sunday. And so I tell her all the time that, it's interesting about that phenomena, and maybe this opens this back up to poets, is like, she could do a thing that no one else can do as a poet. But as an intellectual, and as just like a strange black woman from Brooklyn, has just a world knowledge and a world kind of curiosity about things. But me, as a friend, I've always been like, but nobody can do that sound poetry thing that you do. So I know you're brilliant, and I want you to write everything else that you're writing and do everything else that you're doing, but never stop doing the sound poems. Because even now, this is why it's still in my sort of regimen of teaching, when I get people to try to do what she's doing, always amazing. It's like cathartic. If you have a person listen to her doing that and then try to make them do it in their work, it's something, it's just a whole other notion of like how you break lines or how you write it down. It's just always an amazing trigger for my students.
I'm so glad to hear this from you, Terrance. Yeah. And then again, kudos out to Tracy. Hi, Tracy. Because I noticed that really you consider this literary. You see, I do it visual and I do it literary. What you just talked about was orality, and there ain't much in these books about orality. Like the poetry slam that comes in, you mentioned it for Patricia Smith,
right.
who and you mentioned it for Renegade, who won the haiku slam,
right.
But there's no thing about what that comes on in,
But I don't distinguish that. I mean, I don't distinguish Baraka and Stevens or...
Well, Baraka published all the books, and there's I'm talking about when you tell your student, take that on with that sound poetry, where you're putting it in the realm of the Dada sound poets,
Sure.
all that.
I guess I'm saying to you, what I say to my students is I just don't put in the same regard adjectives in front. Nouns are just more important. So I say we are writing poems. So sometimes the adjective could be spoken word, or it could be experimental, or it could be narrative, or it could be lyric. But my relationship to poetry, I mean, I think that's what the Reflections on a Century is. Like, I just don't really distinguish them. My friend Jericho, who saw the book, and we were talking about it, and he was like, well, it's all these black poets, you know, Mary Evans, Sonia Sanchez, and then suddenly it's like Tony Hoagland and Linda Hall. Where they come? Just like you discovered white people in the 90s. He's laughing. And then I just said, well, you know, I didn't even think about it. That's so true that only later in that do I even contemplate it. But I'm like, but they were my friends. Tony Hoagland's my friend. Linda Hull was a huge influence, and Lucy Bright-Brodo was a friend. So I'm operating that way, as I said to him, instead of some other principle of like it's got to be all black, or it's all got to be all this or all that. So even what you're asking me about sort of distinguishing genres of poetry, I really don't. I just be like teaching it all to people and saying you got to use it all. You want to be a spoken word poet, actually, as well as everything else.
That's a show on its own. But what you do in Watch Your Language is you take your heroes and you turn. To me, it looks like baseball cards that you draw for them.
That's what
I did want to just tip had to come. Let's come back to the abstract drawings in the book at some point, but let's talk. Let's give a minute to the all-stars, because you're right. There is that kind of. If we can just run back to tape ROM for about 20 minutes, and we can listen to the Dorman epic again, because when you get to that tone, which to me really popped, and I think it popped for me the most with Sonia Sanchez and with Michael Harper. Would you mind reading those for us? Because what a voice. That's
Let's see here.
67, at least in my version.
I mean, you know, even this question of like orality and what we're, you know, why I would start with what I read, which is like, I still think like, you know, the speech act and the notion of storytelling, like the notion of the troubadour, always had that performative, oral part of it, you know. So I know people were singing in church and telling stories on the porch, but I still feel like as we're trying to recover it and as we're trying to explore it, this is the things I think about when I'm writing these poems in the middle of the night. It's like, where do you go now to hear people sort of tell their dreams? Where do you go to hear really like, you know, storytelling, not literary fiction. So I'm not saying go to a reading and hear Zadie. I'm saying as we sit with ourselves, as we once did before we could have phones in our pockets, I felt like the phenomena of just, let me tell you what I dreamed last night was just a regular thing. So for me, through the summer, coming out of these books, writing these cards about my favorite writers, I'm still very much there just trying to like retrieve for myself and for like audiences something like that sense of when people were just telling you their dreams or these weird stories. So, you know, the doorman thing is that. I just walked by the doorman and was like, where are the women at? How come I've never seen a woman doorman? And hence the poem. And that phenomena is what I just want everybody to have a capacity for, to just be like, oh, you know, it's like a daydream.
So to speak.
Right, so to speak. So what's wild about these cards is that it's all true. You know, that thing that I'm particularly, you know, having fun with is trying to turn it into allegory, but having everything be rooted in things about their books and where they were born and who they knew, those kinds of things. So this one is Sonia Sanchez, born 1934. To be Sonia Sanchez, you must be born in Birmingham, where your mother dies when you are 1, where your grandmother dies when you are 6, where 4 black girls die when you are 29. Your hair must stutter into the filaments of your mind. To be Sonia Sanchez, you must be inexplicably resilient. Your pigtails must rest on your father's shoulder on the ride to Harlem in 1944. Your hair must be ironed into bangs of decree as you become a black woman with a degree in political science in 1955. Your bangs must grow into an afro as you teach elementary school while pursuing postgraduate studies in poetry in Greenwich Village. To be Sonia Sanchez, your afro must explode into inaugurations of Black Studies programs in universities from California to Pennsylvania, and into lines of Homecoming in 1969, triggering a wake of minds. Your hair must be made of a fiber that makes you both mother and father to twin boys and a daughter. On the cover of Shake Loose My Skin and Homegirls and Hand Grenades, your hair must be the color of Malcolm X's hair upon his return from Mecca. Writing Does Your House Have Lions? Your hair must spiral into the locks of a mane. Writing Wounded in the House of a Friend, your locks must become the lock of an embrace. Your locks must wind into quotation marks around lines of Gwendolyn Brooks, Louise Bogan, Toni Morrison, and Lucille Clifton, and question marks around lines of fire and defense, lines in the sand, chalk lines, and headlines. Your locks must lengthen like a long American sentence, punctuated by the songs of black people. Exclamations of blackness must explode from the filament of your mind. Sure. Michael Harper, born 1938. Beneath the hat is a brain born in Brooklyn. Beneath the hat is my father's face, my mother's Bible. Beneath the hat is Robert Hayden, the Negro folk tradition, Providence, the speckled blues poet, professor, mentor Sterling Brown, and the mad sanctifying farmer turned abolitionist John Brown. Beneath the hat is the militance of a photograph in the passbook of a Bantu under detention, which opens with, "Peace is the active presence of justice," and details a black man with pus swaddling his bandages. Beneath the hat is the shape of an oak's trunk laid bare by the homicidal chainsaw of the state. Beneath the hat is Coltrane asleep on a train, dreaming the names of trees between New York and Philly. Beneath the hat is MSH. Beneath the hat is all of history as apple tree, history as polka dots and moonbeams, history as diabolical materialism. Beneath the hat is the ghost of the brother who died in a motorcycle accident. Beneath the hat is a church of 4 black girls blown up in Alabama, a net holding 500 Middle Passage blacks underwater in Charleston Harbor. Cries and song lines spill from a tenor tethered to the gut of a black man playing on a Wart record player beneath the hat. Beneath the hat is American history, Bigger's blues, Elvin's blues, Martin's blues, a black man's view of suffering, a black man's view of beauty, a black man's view of faith. Beneath the hat is a place a black man can place a few small apples for his children. Beneath the hat is the oily, salty smell clinging to the skin of the apples when the children eat them.
Yeah, I can see those on those baseball cards. They may have a little smaller print than baseball cards, but you got them there.
They became a problem, so.
Well, you nailed, these are praise poems, like I mentioned before, and yet they're also histories, which is what a praise poem is.
Sure.
It's talking about the history there. And another part of the of that book is the whole examination, where you're asking questions of everybody. For example, Terrance, would you is it better for you to write a poem for your birthday or to receive a poem on your birthday?
For me, it's better to write it, but it's nice to give one too. To give someone a poem for their birthday.
Yeah.
But definitely for me, my ideal birthdays would be writing a poem and never talking to anybody else. One of the questions that just always circles back in terms of like what excellence is, or in terms of like how people live, is like, would you rather be the best or the first at something? And I just go back and forth. Like, when you're the first something, it just can't be undone. But the best always has a little bit of anxiety attached to it, So it's like innovation versus just excellence. So those kinds of questions always come back around to how one makes art, or what one expects to get out of the kind of art making process. Like, does it have to be good, or does it have to be like emotional? Does it have to be perfect? Does it have to be real? These kinds of daily questions as you are revising things or trying to make things.
Well, sometimes it seems to me that you go back into it and mess with it so that it ain't perfect.
Well, that's the thing about this Watch Your Language book. I still feel, as I said, that it's still in process, honestly. I only think now when it's out in the marketplace, and I know people are going to review it and talk about it, that becomes actually, anxiety inducing. But yeah, I don't really think of books really being anything but pauses. I mean, when these books are out, I got like 2 other things here to read. I'd probably just read one other thing that I haven't read out that I've been working on since the last time I gave a reading to share with you at some point. But for me, the phenomena of the book is a real moment of taking account or upholding things together, but I really try to get past that as soon as possible and not dwell too much on so my editor knows that I'll never do a selected poems or anything like that. I'm like, y'all can do that when I'm dead. Why would I do that? I just only want to kind of be trying to look forward and not so concerned about excellence again. I mean, I think I've been doing it long enough to be like, I can get like even a B poem some days is going to have to be okay.
That's a B-side.
Right, yeah. But when you're young, you're like, they all got to be A's. I got to be killing it all the time.
Yeah.
You know, but at this point, I'm like, as I said earlier, if I could just be 80 years old, maybe still living by myself and being able to just write a poem every now and again, that when you're talking about living life, because everything is connected to what you think of the poem as. And so if the poem is just an act of bearing witness, where was I? I was somewhere else and somebody was asking me what a poet was. And I was like, I think it's like what a painter is. You know, a poet is somebody who writes poems and a painter is someone who paints. And when you ain't painting, you ain't a painter. You're a painter. You're doing something else. You're walking down the street thinking about painting. When you're not writing poems, you're a poet thinking about poetry, maybe supporting it, but it's a different kind of thing. So if that's true, and it is true for me, I got to be writing. I can't be out selling books because that's not being a poet. You know what I mean? And so I do live with that kind of anxiety, and the only way to really make it not crippling is to not have adjectives about it. It got to be good. You know what I mean? Just
That's
like,
good.
I made something today. You know, that's
you know,
good.
Elizabeth Murray, my wife, if she didn't spend 5 hours in the studio on a day, she was irascible.
Yeah.
Had to do it. Just had to do it.
It's paying attention. We're not asking everybody. None of us in this room, I think all of us in this room making stuff, you know, making this podcast possible for people. We're not really asking people to always exactly do it with the same intensity, but we're saying to you what I said about the dream thing. Like, when you're young, maybe you have opportunities to be like, hey, last night I had this really crazy dream. And what we're really saying to people about that is like, you should give it a little bit of time too. Like, if Elizabeth can do it for 5 hours and has the kind of system that allows her to do that, do it for 5 minutes. And then give it to somebody. You know, I said it about like, if you're a poet, write a poem for your grandmother on her birthday or for your kid or something, and that's enough. Then you're a poet. We ain't saying you got to be Bob Holman. We're saying if you write a poem for your mother on Mother's Day once a year, once a day, you're going to be a poet, and that poem will do some stuff for you. So I do, as a general principle, try not to dwell too much on the sloppiness sometimes of the end product or the questions or problems with the end product, because what I'm really trying to do is like, I can fix that in the next poem. You know, I'll work on that in the next poem, and books sort of don't make that clear all the time. But at this point, you know, in my 50s, that's sort of the stance that I would have.
I think you're kind of making it clear. But let me say, before we move to the next book, which, you know, I do want to, and before I ask you the question, I wanted to ask you the question of, how come at the end of every examination you say, end of 20th century examination part 6 ?
Right.
What's that question mark for,
Terrance?
Terrance?
You know, the whole book, again, watch your language, bear witness, making sure you're paying attention again. But the whole book is questions. The whole book is rooted, almost everything turns on a question in that entire book. So you know what's funny about that? This goes back to like, again, the book just got out, and recognizing when people ask you for book copy, things that could be useful for people. So that's about women being central to both of the books. I'm like, that's obvious if you read it a couple of times, but if you don't, maybe it ain't. Same thing about the driving, reflective questions of everything. Even at the end when the woman's asking me at this talk, what is that? And I'm like, I'm just like, let me think about that.
Great question, you in basketball.
Right. And so throughout it, all of those questions, the whole book is questions. That whole essay, that whole timeline was initially an actual essay that I gave at NYU. And at the time it was in paragraphs, but even then it was just questions, you know, just made up of all these questions. I broke it up as a kind of timeline for the book, but it is an essay asking these questions about like, where does this stuff come from? Where does this poetry come from?
I'm sorry, but I have to ask one more question before I ask you to read one of the poems that you wrote this morning. And that is, I want to go back to what we brought up about the little abstract drawings in here.
Sure.
Like, which came first, the abstract drawings or the or your commentary? Did you draw to the words or write to the drawings?
Which drawings are you talking about?
Oh man, come on, you know what I'm talking about.
These drawings,
those little squares with squiggles.
Yeah,
in them.
I hope people would pay attention to those.
I'm
on
trying.
page
I'm
13.
reading them.
On page 13.
I was right at the end of the book.
If we're talking about the 9 muses of poetry.
No, I wasn't talking about them, but you talk about them, and I'll find the other things I'm talking about.
Yeah, I wonder, because these are really, to me, abstract with the 2 figures inside, and this was definitely something where I was working simultaneously. I had already done the timeline as an essay, remember? Like, it was just 225 questions but it looked like an essay. And then when I was breaking it up and just thinking about the modes of poetry or the questions of poetry, and this bigger question that comes up in this timeline, which is it true? Actually, I've evolved on this question. I'm going to tell you the more recent version of it, but at the time of the book, is it not true that like Black people are the blood of everything, like the blood of creativity, the blood of poetry, even in the absence, that there's, even in Wallace Stevens' Anxiety, which I've written about,
your snow poem.
Is blackness.
Oh my goodness.
All the time. And so working that question of what's inside of it, these figures, which I'll say a few of them, are like double figures. So Calliope or Phyllis Wheatley, that's in the first section of the 9, and it's just a Black girl with a kind of ghostly white girl inside of her. And the next one is the Muse inside, or Jean Toomer. I think that's for the 20s. There's like 3 figures inside of him. This one that's interesting, the Mind or Hiroshima, is like a skull inside of a figure reading, holding a book, and that's just from the decade of, I think that's from the 40s when the bomb was dropped. Yeah. The Shepherd or the Muse of Falling and Catching Up. Here's one that tells you what decade it is, another one. The Space Challenger or the Muse of Mike Tyson. So that's the 80s. And I could pause on that one too. It's just a little figure, again, with a boy sleeping inside of a kind of more pugilist stance of a figure. But the Space Challenger or the Muse and Mike Tyson from the 80s is just for me, like remembering. And I think that shows up in the timeline, this question of thinking when the Space Challenger exploded, that seemed like the worst thing that could happen to us. Vietnam, Hiroshima, and when that thing happened, it seemed like, wow, at my age, even in middle school, and then when you look back on that, it's so not that. It's so almost, it's blooming and booming in a weird kind of way. When you think back about that next to like September 11th and some of the other things that have happened, that's such an innocent disaster now. Isn't that weird? But I'm not saying all that.
But wait a minute, and it's also weird at the moment. You're right. You nailed it when you were that age. It meant this to you then, because your experience at that point was open to this is now, and it's happened to me. It's happened to all of us. It's right here in the newspaper. Look at it on the TV.
Somebody else might write a memoir about that. For me, it's just a little square with the kind of, I think, abstract drawing with the figure and these 2 questions. Is the 80s the Space Shuttle Challenger for me, or is it when I learned about Mike Tyson, also in the 80s? When I learned about this dude named Mike Tyson.
Well, everybody, I was down in Florida. Man. Everybody was letting it out of the bag here.
But the question of how much I need to talk about that anywhere other than this moment is what I'm always sort of dealing with. And so I know a lot of stuff gets missed. I'm okay with that.
Well, the one thing, I got to go back to an earlier moment where we talked about the only footnote in the book is when the asterisk happens on page 160, but you got to read the footnote on page 13.
Which one you want me? 160 footnote and the footnote on 130. Well, the footnote again is just sort of it's setting us up.
You're gonna talk about it. Good.
Where is it?
Okay.
160 is the Tim Siebel's.
Yeah, this asterisk. What's that asterisk about?
Let me see here. Everyone is Hispanic collection quintessential.
Not supposed to read that part. It's just for me, Bob.
Well,
because I couldn't find anything on that page 13 that refers to it. Not to get too nitpicky.
Well, you know what? I guess it's good that they didn't put it in. I don't even know if I want to say this online. Like the last thing of 175, what that initially was. Actually, no, that footnote I thought was going to my cards, the card deck that they didn't include on here. But initially what that thing is referring to is just this idea of who's gotten left out of the 250 years of poetry. And, again, like, I could say it this whole way because then it'll be almost like an apology or something. So, I had gotten the book, the 250 years that Kevin Young had edited, and I think we maybe had talked about it on the way to it. So when I started doing these cards, it was partly because of the people that were in there that I didn't know, and the people who were missing.
Right.
So at the time, I didn't think of it as extremely critical of the anthology.
Yeah.
But I do now, like the way that that's framed, and I think maybe that's why the asterisk is going, so it doesn't like highlight the fact that really that whole Tim Siebel's thing grows out of the fact that he was overlooked in that book. He had like one poem in it. And so at one point that asterisk was sending you all the way to the back as a note. But I kind of feel like maybe Kevin saw it already when it was in the Yale Review and got mad about it.
Kevin, We love you, Kevin. And
Shout out to
what
Kevin
would we
Young.
do without you? Now, because I love it in my read, that asterisk takes me back to this important moment of these abstract, non-abstracts.
Right.
The other abstracts that I'm talking about are on page 135 in your Frank Stanford
Sure.
part. You know, in the battlefield where the moon says, I love you, something I've taught many times. And you give a great rendition. That's 135. You've got, actually, it's 136 where you've got these two. He
Right.
dreamed up a typewriter big as a combustion baby tractor on the weeping willow tree called Black Stallion and typed one 500-page long sentence in a night, which is Frank's modus operandi.
Right.
So did these drawings, how did they relate to those paragraphs?
How about this, how things grow out of things. In the beginning of this essay, the thing that I was really working out was what you just showed me. You have the cover of his book right in front of us here.
Right.
And I had made this drawing that put Frank Stanford
look at that.
in front of it.
Wow, yes, of course,
Because, and this is in the book, he had two covers of the book. This is the original cover.
Yeah.
And then this was again, it was one of those things where I was like, I better draw it because I don't want to get in trouble. But when I put it in the book, they kept it. I didn't hear from anybody about it.
I'm sure.
Was it my permission?
Pegasus Forrest is probably doing it. Who knows who's doing it now? Lost Roads.
So here's the thing. Even with the cards, because that's one of the later pieces. I think I published it after the book came out when somebody was asking me, could they have something from the book? I was like, you could take this Frank Stanford one because they kept growing. I also had one with drawings and kind of abstract things about Frank O'Hara. And after I had gotten like maybe my second pass on the book and I looked at that O'Hara one, and I thought this about another piece that I had written on Audre Lorde called Erotic City, Audre Lorde and Prince. That thing was about 50 pages. This thing on Frank O'Hara was maybe 20 pages. And I just couldn't let go of the Frank Stanford one. But it's similarly, those were pieces that grew out of the cards. Like I was doing a small thing and maybe I had this one drawing. So I was initially just trying to meditate on the relationship between those two covers. Frank Stanford's original cover, which is something from Vietnam actually on that original cover. And then this other one with the black kid on it and the sphere, but it kept growing. So I think of that Frank Stanford piece in the book as one of the most intuitive and weird and wild ones. But that's sort of where they were going. If I say they started with like something like that Sonia Sanchez card, which is an early one. I sent that one to her, Mike narrative. But at the end of that process of writing these things, and these were like, recent. These weren't, as I said, something I had written 20 years ago. These are things that I was doing during the pandemic and just sort of having fun drawing, like again, really loving that cover. At the end of that series, I'm on it. If you look at that whole essay, the very last piece in that Frank Stanford piece is a self-portrait of me in the place of that black kid.
Oh my goodness!
But again, this is what I mean about like just saying I almost just want to say to
This
people,
one here.
yeah, right. That's
There
me down
you
at the bottom.
are.
But I feel like if somebody was reading a book for 5 years, maybe in the 5th year they would notice something like that one afternoon and get a chuckle out of it. But do I expect everybody to get all of it? I'm saying like every page has. This is what I just said to you about the Mike Tyson thing. Like everything. That Mike Tyson piece, which is just the size of a stamp, was like a whole thing. It was like a drawing and a bunch of stuff, and I shrank it down. So I feel like, maybe classes will get some of this stuff sometimes, but a bunch of kids are standing around. They'll pick up the things that one individual would only get after reading the book a couple of times.
Well, at least, and never, never, because you got it, and you're just living it and doing it, and the richness of being a multi-artist and allowing yourself to be a hobbyist or an amateur, or I'm doing it for myself, folks. Art is that, and if you don't like the poem, who else is going to like that poem? Although it is true that the poet is the last person to understand the poem that they have written.
That's how I feel about the Octavia Butler drawing in the Book of Poems, which also went in like, I don't know, I'll never probably read that one. But
the Sestina that's only drawing.
She's right. She's the only one that shows up in both of them. That drawing is in the timeline, Octavia Butler, and then there's obviously a little sequence of her in the series of poems. But I can't explain that either. I can't explain that the drawing.
Don't
poem.
explain.
Like it's there. As you said, poets are the last to know.
So listen, why don't you read us that new poem of yours here? You want to do that?
Yeah.
Because I want to get back on track to ask you a couple of things about the poems you got here.
Okay, and I would say too, like new poems. I've been working on them all month. Even that one I just read you. I've been playing with this. So this one, where is this?
I'm just teasing you when I said you wrote it this morning.
From a story.
You should say I wrote this on the subway coming down here, Bob.
But I don't know how common the story that set this poem into motion, called Untold Luxury Love Boat Tragi-Romantic Cruises. I feel like, again, with these new things, I haven't sent it out anywhere. How about I just read it and then we'll see if y'all know what I'm talking about.
All right.
Okay. Untold Luxury Love Boat Tragi-Romantic Cruises. Yeah, this is maybe like last week. In the earliest accounts, the first league of elderly couples leapt from Noah's Ark and were transformed into assorted birds before they hit the holy waters. Others report the first overboard were elderly Africans amid middle passages. The ancient mariner and his wife stepped quietly into a vast sea from a wooden boat they'd built to weather several great and terrible years together. The meaning of each tale depends upon who tells the tale. The wood of the boat can be cedar, which is rot resistant but requires complex care, or the wood can be ash, which bends easily but fades to gray over time. The thing that happens is true. Senior couples spend their life savings on spectacular 3 to 4 month long 7-sea world tour cruises where they jump hand in hand into the sea on emerald anniversaries. The hawk, the albatross, the canary, the vulture, the raven, the kind of bird flying above the route of the luxury love boat depends upon who tells the tale. What if one lover wishes to become smoke rooted in odor after death, and the other wishes to become a single seed sparkling into vibrant yellow petals or a very tall mulberry tree? Some elderly couples married 500 years or more by a mountain or seashore are said to take no cruises, the last of their long hours before strolling into an emerald swamp or forest. On the biggest and most adrift of the cruises, each of the more than 1,000 luxurious suites is painted a different pattern, texture, or color, and the couple spend a portion of each day simply absorbing the atmosphere. The bird flying above these voyages flies in 2 directions at once, toward the center and toward the darkness, with a far-off song that can only be heard by the few great, terrified, elderly couples that come back. Is that clear? You know what's going on in there?
Yeah, of course.
Did you know this story? A friend was just telling me this thing about elderly people taking these cruises and then jumping overboard. Like, they spend all their money, they have these world-long cruises. So I looked it up. I had never heard it.
I never heard it.
And you know what I found? I found a bunch of stories of older people falling overboard. I found that story of a 90-year-old falling overboard with his 70-year-old wife. So they ain't saying people were jumping, they're saying there were accidents. So that one thing that I heard, just sort of imagining what that looks like. And, through most of the poem, I was reconciling, it's about suicide. It's about, like, couple suicide. And this time, where suicide is so high, I almost was like, if I can't get out of the poem with a better ending than that, I'm done. And at some point, because of the person who told me the story and was like, talking about her parents living by the ocean or something like that, I was like, well, what's worse than the people who jump overboard after being married, 100 years, is the people who come back. Like, we took this trip and either you got too scared to jump overboard. Again, questions. Why you come back? You didn't do it. Should you have done it? Can you die with another person? Must you die alone? So again, these are just, questions that sort of keep me going more than things about books. But like, I'm talking to you like it's the thing that I'm still working out, even if
I'm hearing you like a person who's just heard the poem for the first time, although I believe, stop me here now, that I have read a version of it somewhere. Excuse me, Ram, cut that out, that's that cough. But you start off in the Ark. and you
Right.
end up with the return. So
Right.
to me, it's you're traveling through, even though it's a cruise ship, you're
Right.
traveling through the rough seas of life, and then it's just 40 days later, the rain stops, and you're coming out of there. So, I mean, it's only completely different from what you're intending there, but it's perfect, isn't it?
Well, I mean, again, this is the thing about poems are not read; they're only reread. Because when I had thought about expanding the poem, you know what I was meditating on?
Yeah.
The metaphor of the wood. Like, if marriage is like
You
wood,
love wood. I got to tell you
I grew
that
up around
much.
trees in the
Oh,
South.
my
But
goodness.
they're on this boat, they jump aboard. So that analogy that comes to me out of the idea of like, well, some people, and I'm really talking about marriage as a person who's divorced and as a person who has friends who were recently married into their third marriages. That's what, and even the person who brought the story to me still comes out of like, what is the nature of people's relationship. But it's the thing that I did not see all the way through, which is, if a wood can be like cedar, which is, it's rot resistant, but you got to really take care of it. A marriage can be like that. Or if it can be ash, which is like very flexible, but grays over time. So it's like, if your marriage is very flexible, is that boring? Do you want a kind of tension in the marriage all the time? Is it worth it to care? So what I kept going with is like, well, what if your marriage is like pine? Or what if your marriage is like birch?
Oh, yeah.
But that's another poem.
Well,
Like,
there you go.
I
Well,
cut
there
it
you go with
short.
them similes you get.
Right.
You
And
damn
the birds.
poets.
What if your marriage is like an albatross or a canary? So it doesn't make it into the poem because I kind of don't know really necessarily.
Yesterday I was up at St. John the Divine for the memorial for Ralph Lee, the great puppeteer and theater guy. And the story was told about how when he was drilling a hole through a piece of weathered wood, a plank from off of a barn, he used a hand drill. And he put it down, and he turns it, and the shavings come up out of it, and the smell comes up out of it. Mm-hmm. And how different, this is analogous to orality, or when poetry was made by hand.
Yeah.
Even if that's an Olivetti typewriter and Frank O'Hara doing his lunch poems for you.
I'm making my
grad
grad students write tomorrow. I have little books, I have pens, and I'm saying to them, again, just trying to like cross the bridge between what I think and what I do, saying to them tomorrow when they come into my class with their poems already written and ready to be stars, I want y'all to handwrite the poems we're going to work on today.
Beautiful, beautiful idea.
What are they going to do?
With Steve Cannon, when we were doing our little workshop called The Stoop, Steve, who's blind, would have the poet read the poem, and then somebody else in the workshop would read the poem so that you get it from two voices.
That's right.
You'd be able to
that
triangulate through it. And Steve, of course, because he was blind, or because his hearing was so good, or because he was just such a great teacher, would always be able to nail what's going on in between the two voices.
That's
you
right.
know?
That's right.
Yeah.
Subtext, text, and context. But as I said, I mean, I love to be just trying to pick up these things because, again, for me, the idea of poems as just capturing everything, witnessing everything. So the line between, what I was thinking about the other day because of being in this position, it's like, well, when filmmakers make movies, after you have made that movie, or in the lead up to the movie, you're running around talking about it. But by the time the movie comes out, you're kind of on to the next thing. Maybe that's true for painters too. But for writers, somehow, when the book is new to everyone, it has to suddenly kind of be new to you again. And I'm like, well, a lot of the stuff that I was thinking about in that book, I was writing when I was thinking about it. So that's sort of why I'm always emphasizing the idea of like, you just want to always be working on something as opposed to thinking about something that you already thought about.
Going back. You go forward. Yeah, but there's a way in which, in your do-it-yourself sestinas, where you turn the poem into a machine. Mm-hmm. You see the form. Like you're on top of all this that we've talked about. We haven't really hit on this yet, but you are an extraordinary formalist, And so I'm wondering what you think about these forms now. So this is for you millennials out there. What are you up to with AI and blockchain and poetry, and how do you think those things intersect?
I like AI. I've been using the voice one to actually, the piece I read first was just too long because I have this AI program online, 11 Labs. So I have Sylvia Plath in there. So all you have to do is put a snippet of someone's voice in, and then, this is problems, but I'm going to give you this answer here. As I said, you put a person's voice in. I've done it with myself.
Literal voice, like this is what my
if you have
voice
any
sounds like.
audio, like a minute or so, you feed it into this AI system and it'll replicate it. So the rhythm hasn't been worked out, but I think the system hadn't even been around for a year. So inevitably, all of the rhythm stuff, I can tell over my, membership these past months that it'll get better and better. So here's the thing that I say to people about that. So what I have right now using this system is like everybody I've ever wanted to hear read a poem. The Walt Whitman America is too grainy.
Oh yeah,
to get him.
That's on a wax cylinder, right?
But anybody else, anybody, Wallace Stevens, if you can get like a minute or two of anything recorded and feed it into it, it'll give you a pretty decent version of it. So I now use it for myself sometimes when I just want to not hear myself reading a poem. So all of my poems, I'm always reading them out loud. So I use it for that a lot. And what I was going to say, in the classroom, I use it for like Sylvia Plath poems that I never had before, other poems. I mean, I have so much audio. It's like a whole side gig of the audio I have of people reading their poems. People will send them to me sometimes. Here's the thing, though. I say to people, all of this stuff, all of the AI stuff, the education is the only place you should be experimenting with it. So outside of education, in the marketplace and just in the intellectual property space, this stuff is very scary. But for me, I'm the only person using it the way it's supposed to be used, because I'm like, now I can have these people in the classroom, even for like grammar stuff. I say, I ain't got no problem with spell check. Like AI is an advanced version of spell check. I spell terribly, so I definitely use it for that. I use it to correct things all the time. And I think my friends know too, I'm a bit of a little like tech nerd in that way in the side. Like I watch YouTube on AI, about AI stuff. I have all the prompts and every kind of way to kind of make it work the way it should work. But I do think it's because I'm a teacher. It's because I am not trying to make money off of anything I do in that space. And the challenge is always that someone's going to use it to take advantage of people. And I think that's a real thing. But I have no qualms about how much I use it, because it always comes down to teaching.
Well, Mr. Teacher, I have a little pop quiz for you here right now, okay? I'm going to give you some index cards, and I'm going to ask you just to read the words that are on there. Then you can talk about it if you want, but that's all what I'm doing.
Okay. Golden sardines. Yeah, that's that. You want me to tell you what that is? Is that I'm supposed to answer
I don't know. You know what it is.
Kaufman?
It's Bob
Yeah,
Kaufman.
yeah,
But what you don't know is that his wife, Eileen, once told me that you don't pronounce it like that. Bob didn't.
What, sardines?
He said sardines.
Oh, really? Is there some kind of New Orleans thing?
It could be New Orleans, or it could be just what happens when you come back from what do we call it when you don't speak? For
vows of silence.
Vows of silence, which he did. The only time I met him, man, I want to tell you, I was like in his mouth, because he was toothless. It was just right near his death.
I definitely followed him too. I watch all the documentaries. Bob Kaufman's an amazing figure. Another one who should have a movie. How can we not have a film about? A dramatization. Maybe Jeffrey Wright could play him or somebody like that.
Should be great. That David Henderson did an amazing 4-hour audio biography.
I did not know that. I did not know that.
You got to look for that. And we're all thinking of you, David, out there in the Riverview nursing home. Everybody should check out who knows when you're going to hear this, but if you want to support David Henderson at
definitely,
this point.
Definitely.
Great. Okay,
a poet too, right? Did David Henderson have a book on Tia Chucha? Did he publish poems too?
No, he had.
I'm thinking Dwight Okita.
Yeah. A shout out to Luis here. I didn't know that was your first book. Oh my goodness, Luis, we love you.
That's right.
Okay, we're being like your book. We're sending it out.
There's too many people to thank.
Exactly.
Okay, so Golden Sardines.
No, he did. The Mayor of Harlem was his first book. It came out from Harper and Row, and that was that moment in the late '60s or mid '60s when all of a sudden poetry got hot. And they published David's book, and they published Victor Hernandez Cruz's book.
They were all in Black Fire, I think.
Yes. Oh yeah. Now listen, we'll talk about Baraka and your comments on him later. But now let's go on to the next card.
Okay, I saw this one. Adrian Rich, another one.
No, hold on.
That's what it says. Is that my?
But that's not how she said it.
How she said Adrian?
Adrian.
Okay.
Adrian. I'm telling this mainly for the people out there listening to.
You know what?
Tell me.
Yesterday, a few days ago, I was walking in Brooklyn with Tracy Morris, and I said something about Bed-Stuy, And for the next 10 minutes, she was telling me that I was saying it wrong. She was like, you're saying it the way Biggie Smalls would say it, but he was totally playing when he would say it in his songs. He was like elongating it. So she was like, so now I often will meet these white kids from the Midwest who will be talking to me and say Bed-Stuy the way you just said. She said, it's a tale. It's a tale. And what I said to her is what I'm going to say to you. Well, I'm just a black dude who just read shit. I ain't never talked to nobody. Who else was I going to ask how to say Adrian Rich other than reading it in a book? And I said, I am like the white kids who grew up listening to Biggie Smalls and thinking that I didn't come from there. So I said, I don't know if I'm going to change the way I say it. I think it shows that how I came to the word.
I love you, Terrance Hayes. Nobody's ever said that to me before. That's the way to do it. I'm going to keep that, Adrian Rich, knowing that the person who says it back to me doesn't know either.
Yeah, I never heard anybody say it. I read it. But Adrian, you're right. I heard that before too.
Okay.
Adrian.
Who's next? What's next?
Yusuf Komenyaka.
Okay, anything about that?
Other than knowing his real name. Yusuf Komenyaka? What about that?
Well, I know this is unfair after you told me how you spell, but I misspelled it just to see if you would know how to spell it. So
with the two A's?
The
two M's.
The two M's. Two A's.
I wouldn't embarrass you. What if you had spelled it by mistake? I'd be embarrassed.
Well, you know, Ram does comic books.
Oh yeah.
That
was a great comic book.
Oh man.
Y'all did the show here. It's a figure Jupiter Simmons. Jupiter something.
Say it, Ram.
Yeah, it was a good book. Yeah, I'll be following. I think y'all had that run online or something. I saw it.
That's Ram all over.
That was great. That was great. Nobody has to know that I be keeping up, but yes, I saw that.
Shout out to
Yusuf. He is very proud of that.
Okay.
No, Yusuf is one of my keys. Yusuf is one of my ground
beautiful
floors.
in the book.
Yeah,
for sure.
He's definitely as important as Toy.
Is in there too. Oh,
yeah,
Toy.
Toy's super important. Yusuf
Toy,
important.
you did it. She's right there. She's your halo, man.
Yeah, both of them.
Is there anything else, or do we do it all?
Again, I would just say about like what teachers really do, because when I think about Yusuf, I just think about how many people he just randomly mentioned. Linda Hall, James Carroll Booker. One of the great piano players of New Orleans. Yusuf was the person who told me about him. It was like, oh, I was living in New Orleans. He was like, you should just check him out. And after listening, I mean, this is, again, a story people know, 25 years ago. After doing what Yusuf told me to do, I listened to him, and I went and bought a piano, and I started playing the piano after listening to this dude. And I said then, when I bought that piano 25 years ago, man, if I could be as good as him, I would give up poetry. And it'd probably take me 50 years. And so I still play. I'm on my second piano. I play a couple of hours a day. I think I could fool you for about 3 minutes. You know, if you were listening, taking 20 years to get a good solid 3 minutes of like, you know, Sati down or something like that. But Yusuf. And same thing about Linda Hall. Linda Hall, totally, I had no idea who she was. And he was like, I studied with her. She had just died. And he told me to check her out. And again, like with the United States of Poetry, upon that discovery, everybody that knows me has now discovered it. Once I have found out about it, everybody's going to know that Linda Hall is super bad. Everybody's going to know that James Booker is the most amazing piano player there. He taught Harry Connick Jr. He taught Dr. John how to play the organ. Amazing dude. But again, somehow never really, there's a documentary about him, but not well known. But that comes from Yusuf.
You know who else has picked up the piano is Ishmael Reed.
Oh, really? Okay.
Oh, yeah. Ishmael's got 2 CDs out now, and his last play, The Conductor, is the play uses his music in the play. You got to check it out.
Definitely check
I'm
it
telling you, because Ishmael's somebody.
Another one. Can we talk about Ishmael? He too is not even, you know, Nikki Finney. I don't have enough about Ishmael.
Or Nikki Giovanni.
Al
You got
Young.
a question? Oh, yeah.
Right.
We can go down. That's why I'm saying the index should be all the names that aren't in the book.
I agree. Will Alexander. There's so many. You're right. So many real.
That'd be
so
good.
Really
That'd be good. The index of who's not in the book, man. And then people be left out of that. Then they'd really be upset.
That's right.
Well, you know that Banning Eyre, who's one of the founders of Afropop, found himself in Africa because he wanted to play one lick that Jelamati Tankura could play, the head of the rail band. And he said, okay, I want to play that. And he says, 6 months. And he lived on the floor and learned that lick in 6 months.
That's pretty good.
And he wrote this book called On the Griot Trail. That's really worth getting at.
I can do some Sati. I can do some Professor Longhair.
I love your
minimalism.
Sati.
But I can't really. I mean, I can't play, obviously. I certainly can't play like Dr. John or James Booker. But this goes back to what I was saying to you earlier.
Professor Longhair.
And it grows, Professor Longhair, any of them. The way this grows out of what we've been talking about is like, I sort of don't mind, especially when I'm living by myself. It doesn't have to sound good. It just has to be a pretty good way to pass the time.
Listen to Ishmael's, because I think he's doing, you guys on par. Right. You're going to love each other.
Improvising. I've never met Ishmael, But again, another one.
Ish. We're going to call him up right now.
Huge influence. So he's so far out in California. But what I was going to say about that again, and I do mention him. Do I mention him in the piece about Lucille Clifton?
I don't remember.
Very quickly, really. Maybe I mentioned about her growing up in Buffalo. But what I was going to say to you about that is, again, amazing, amazing story. Just all you got to do, Spike Lee, is go find these brilliant people. They don't have to be black, but you can find enough of them just looking for black folks like Ishmael Reed. Yeah. And just tell that story. I mean, it's just another amazing figure that's walking among us. I think it's about Sonia too. I think it's about Sammy Delaney too. There's just people out there.
Chip. That was going to mention Chip up there for you, because I don't think he makes it in the book.
No,
Octavia's all over it. But where's Chip?
Another one. But
he's in the index.
Obviously, I'm doing something about Octavia and the tree. But I'm saying to you very specifically, like, that these people, maybe once they pass, but even to do the Audrey and Rich thing, I say that too. Like, still really hasn't had her day. I don't think Gwendolyn Brooks is really.
Gwen is absolutely.
Yeah,
okay. Here's my Gwendolyn Brooks stories. Because I brought her in to read at the Poetry Project. Yeah. I had her read with Ntozake Shange.
Oh, great!
Okay.
So you didn't record none of this stuff?
It's recorded. Now it's in the Library of Congress. Yeah. So. Zaki goes first, because that's the way it is. So Zaki went first with an attitude.
Right.
All right. And she says, well, this is like, now after she's just raised the roof and done everything to the poem that you could do, including the orgasm at the end.
Yeah,
and then she says, now we'll hear some poems from Gwendolyn Brooks.
Oh, wow.
Oh, man. Yeah. And Gwendolyn gets up there and she says, oh, here are my poems. She threw it right back at her and went into a reading that blasted right off of her energy and took it right through the roof.
I was trying to say that in the piece about Gwendolyn Brooks. Gwendolyn Brooks was a total trickster. She was
man.
Totally like, a winky, side-eye kind of figure. People think she's such a, school mom.
No way.
Yeah, she definitely would cut her. I mean, I just know this from people even who liked her, even people who she liked. She could still give you a quick read.
When she came over to the New Eurekan, she not only stayed through the slam, but stayed through the open room, as we called it, thanks to Miguel Algarin.
Right.
The open room that went till 4 a.m. She was still there.
She's the main one.
Yeah,
all
she's
the people
main
we're
one.
talking about.
She's in that.
Because let's say this again about the untold stories. How these? I mean, does it seem simple to just be like if it was made into a movie? I'm just suggesting to you what's overlooked. Because Gwendolyn Brooks's life, if you just told her life, you would be telling the life of the last century. You'd be telling the life of migration from 1916, moving from Kansas with her parents into Chicago. You'd be telling the story of the Chicago Renaissance and the Detroit Renaissance. Everybody talks about the Harlem Renaissance, but the black people that made their way to Chicago from the South, from Mississippi, and to Detroit from Alabama, those black people made Motown. They made the Chicago poetry scene. They made blues, all these. So this is Gwendolyn Brooks. Through all of that is what I'm saying to you. If you were looking for one figure to be present through all of these phases of the last century, it's only her. The next good example, Audrey and Rich and Allen Ginsberg. If you were to track Allen Ginsberg's life, you would get a lot of what happened in the last century. That's like Forrest Gump. You ain't even got to make Forrest Gump up. You have the actual Forrest Gump and Gwendolyn Brooks and figures like that who lived through the century.
She wrote to me about my first book, and I said, I need a blurb. She said, Bob Holman's poetry is full of jounce and pounce.
Oh, that's good. The jounce is what's
That's her, isn't it?
Jounce.
She gave me a jounce, and that's me too.
Right.
By
Amazing figure. Amazing. I'm like, she's like, Szymborska, another name I never know how to say. Was Laura
You
Szymborska.
did good with that one.
Another one who's like, she's the equivalent. Like, if Szymborska this is in the book, if she wins the Nobel, if you think about Brooks next to her, you can see how certainly she should have also.
Absolutely.
And it would have been a different history, a different century, if she had been given the Nobel like she clearly should have gotten.
Well, you're one of the great things is that you've taken it upon yourself to rectify all these wrongs and to say it in the books.
That's
and,
right.
and
including female doormen, including saying we need some women doormen. So instead, I'm going to make them the original door people since we don't see them around town.
Yeah, it reminds me of what Paul Auster did in his book. About Stephen Crane. What is that book? It's called Lost Boy, Fire Boy, Storm Boy. Oh, it's Paul, forgive me. But he says he's been taken out of the canon, but he should be there. Sure. And his poems are crazy.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah,
we're doing that a lot, trying to make sure people. This is the Wanda Coleman thing. Like another one that we have to make sure is not forgotten. There's so many people like another one with an amazing, amazing life story. Her mama was Ronald Reagan's maid.
She interviewed Charlie Manson
and Bob Marley. She won an Emmy. She wrote for General Hospital. She also wrote for Black Tail, the porn magazine. Come on now, Wanda Coleman.
Coleman.
We're just getting started. Somebody out west is doing I should say like somebody because I think I'm going to work with this young woman who's doing a dissertation on her. And I was like the first of many. Like again, like Gwendolyn Brooks, when we get ahead a couple of decades and look back, we'll see certainly. Patricia Smith, another one. She's with us now, but if you fast forward and look back on
when she was winning the National Poetry Slams 8 years in a row. I mean, and this is women taking over here too. Don't forget, this is this is the 90s, early 90s.
I said in the book, if you want to really understand American poetry of the last century, you just would look at the Black women poets, and you'll get to everybody else through them.
That is the truth. But look at you. You're doing the work, though. That's what I love about you, Terrance, because you have the selected of Wanda that you did, beautiful and hardcover too. I know you fought for that. It's just
Wanda's amazing. I mean, again.
And then you model your own sonnets after her to give even more. But don't stop me before I get to Gwendolyn Brooks and your Golden Shovel, because what more could you do to give tribute to a poet than to create a form in her name?
But I'm just going to again say,
take a minute.
Making poems is what I'm always getting at. And I would say I'm a reader. I mean, what you're seeing is a person who liked the library. You're seeing a person who, whether they would sort of show up or not, obviously if I love Wanda Coleman, Wanda I knew, Brooks I didn't, but it's the same principle of like reading what they do and wanting to learn from them. So to watch Wanda do those American sonnets and then want to try to do them like her. The first one I wrote was for her. It's in the, she was still alive when I sent it to her. It's in the book before the sonnets. It's called American Sonnet for Wanda C. No one looking at that book would have known necessarily what was going on, but I didn't even know at the time I was going to write a next book of sonnets. I was just showing her, as a person that loved her, how I was thinking about what she was doing. And so through all of it, those kinds of, when those things happen, when I'm inventing forms, I guess, it's slightly different than like the sestina forms or the anagram forms that I've made up. But what I'm really doing is saying to people to do the same thing, to say that reading will lead you to your own poems. And that's what that usually is for me.
Yeah. One of the things you didn't mention about Wanda when you talked about her sources, and of course she writes poems in the voice of, just like you, she'll take on anybody. Carlos Williams, let me at him,
she loved to imitate people. Those rogue something she called it, rogue gallery where she's imitating everybody.
But I said to her once, how come you're writing these poems? She said, Bob, I'm just writing. Sounds like you. I'm just writing because that's how I make my money.
Right.
And she really looked on, I have to create this to pay the rent.
Because she was too wild to teach. Yeah. She was way too crazy. I say this all the time, and it's on record, and I only imply it sort of in that intro that I wrote. She never came to Cave Canem. Actually, if we were really going to get controversial, I would say, Ishmael Reed has never been to Cave Canem. So these things have to be corrected immediately, because again, not only is a circle like that, an organization, whatever these organizations are, Asian American organizations, white organizations like Bread Loaf, Cave Canem, whatever, once you get a bunch of artists organized with our crazy, fucked up, traumatic selves, the people that are too crazy to come into that circle, maybe Ntozake Shange too, have to be especially taken care of. Well, so Gwendolyn Brooks is different, but she's not different because Gwendolyn Brooks stayed in her neighborhood. So not only the crazy-ass, alcoholic, maniac poets that we want to take care of, because they're our students too, it's also the people who are sort of just outside of our zone. So I think that about, I know it's weird to say that maybe about the West Coast too, but I think that about a lot of West Coast poets. Al Young, Will Alexander, and Ishmael, ironically. And I think about Midwestern, that's Gwendolyn Brooks.
You are answering your own question about why Gwendolyn was not in Black Fire.
That's right.
Because it was simply because she wasn't part of the Harlem Renaissance. And, Larry Neal, shout out to you, Larry, and Ishmael, were, they're blind. Back in those days, really, before the internet, you don't know what a community of poets is like it is right now.
Right.
When Gwendolyn Brooks wrote about Paul Beatty's book, this book is to be taken as a sign.
Yeah.
Then that was the thing that opened up the floodgates between the two of us and the Nuyorican and her and all this in the United States
Bob,
poetry.
Listen, I'm going to pause and say what I said a minute ago, which is Ishmael Reed has not been to one of the most important and significant poetry organizations of the last 20 years. And so you'd be like, why though? How does that happen? Is that an oversight? That's the kind of stuff I think about. Now, the organization is fine. He's fine too, but that overlap that you're talking about, which is what Gwendolyn Brooks would do when you say this thing about Paul. Someone always has to be there making sure
that's
that
a poet's role too.
Yeah.
And you do that, even though not even though, but Cave Canem comes into its own in your book.
Sure.
It's given the props that it needs, that Cornelius and Toy, what they started. It took a while to evolve into what it is.
Right.
And the poets who coming into it now, the young poets, they see it as it is, just like you were seeing the Challenger. They come in and see it as it is, think it's always been this way. Right.
But they too would be doing what I'm sort of stressing here again and again through the conversation is like, it's so easy just to see yourself once those kinds of places get built. And thinking about like always, because again, I'll say what I said a minute ago, and I don't know who listened to this stuff, and I've never met Ishmael Reed, so I'm not saying anything direct about his personality, but I did meet Wanda, and so I'm saying to you, just because a poet can be eccentric, put any kind of word you want in there, eccentric, challenging, unusual, don't show up, they poets. The noun is poet, so you should expect that. And so for people to sort of like be surprised when poets can't be teachers, which Wanda again would not necessarily have been a great teacher, a great poet, then they're like, that's a totally different kind of question that you're asking. You still have a responsibility to these people, especially more so even like I think about Edgar Allan Poe, there's so many, the Van Goghs of the poetry world where you sort of like have to make sure that these people who don't want to necessarily wear the uniform that you have worn, that I wear to be a professor, are taken care of. And so I it's a revelation. Like I was like, I think I mentioned, I'm not sure if I mentioned Ishmael in that. I think he did because I think
he might be in the Buffalo.
I think about him, and Lucille together as another kind of incredible phenomena, that proximity between those two. But again, I say to you, even that fact, what shocks me and what makes my sweat beat up as we talk about it is that always feeling of having forgotten people or overlooked people and then trying to more account for that constantly. So that's really what I feel today. Like, oh yeah, man, Ishmael Reed, the cowboy from Raw, those novels. Come on, Blazing Saddles is all Ishmael Reed. And then you're like, he's still on the planet. He's still with us.
He's still so active.
He's still with us. He should be like he should be in the front of everybody's mind the way that your grandparents are in the front of your mind all the time.
Believe me, he's in front of my mind.
Good.
Don't worry.
Good.
And so is his daughter Tennessee, who was my student.
Yeah.
So
that's the thing. That's the thing. Joyce Carol Oates, I think that about.
Yeah.
Another one who is just like, if people don't think of these figures as heroes.
Do you think that the cancel? Are we touching? And we don't want to go into it. The cancel culture here,
I'm not. I'm talking about artists.
You're just talking about artists. But there are poets who.
But that goes under the umbrella of just beginning by saying what a poet would be. So when my mother talks about me, I say this all the time. When people say, "What's your son do?" She says, "My son is a professor." If she gets my book, she sells them to people around town who knows me, but she don't really mess with that creative part. It's too volatile. It might hurt her feelings. She don't understand it.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, that's right. Tell people I am a professor, and then I'll work on like professing and kind of prioritizing that over like my creating or making things. But I feel like so much of it is just trying to account for that and then asking other people to account for it too. As I said, like witness and then conveying that witness, but there's always so much that gets overlooked. And it's not, as I said, incidental to certain kinds of personalities. Ntozake Shange, again, I ain't trying to talk out of school about nobody, but I could just say that Wanda is the one I really knew. And I would say, like, we got along, but it was a learning curve, and I understood that she was hurt, and a lot of artists come, the work is growing out of some kind of trauma and woundedness to begin with. So you have to have a bit more empathy for challenging people inside of the whole arts world, obviously, but certainly for poets because of our closeness to, like, universities and professors. Painters maybe don't have that problem. A painter, Henry Taylor, name them. They can be eccentric and do what they do at the fringes of the art world and still be paid.
Oh, Francis
Poets,
Bacon.
though,
Let's go.
Yeah, of course, and still doing just fine. But Wanda Coleman and other poets who, for whatever reason, can't get that kind of support of the university structure, those people we got to take care of. We got to be teaching them because they can do what we can't do. They're a little wilder than all of us. That's the Frank Stanford thing, too. And, Frank Stanford versus C.D. Wright. I mean, we're just still going to it. Like, C.D. Wright has to talk about Frank Stanford. She has to protect him because he's a purer and wilder and rooted version of what she is. And that's how I feel about Wanda. That's how I feel about Gwendolyn, Toy, Etheridge, Yusuf, Keats,
Oh, my goodness.
Shakespeare, Stevens, too. It's complicated. Wallace. That's why I'm saying, like, all these people, you're absorbing them and hoping that you can...
I, like Gwendolyn, refused to fly.
Right.
That's what that's a new question for you.
Sure. What's that?
What mode of transportation do I and Gwendolyn Brooks have in common? Something like that.
And John Madden. I think John Madden doesn't like to fly either, the old football coach.
Hey, listen, do you want to read a couple poems to get out of here?
Sure.
Oh, but first let me just mention this one thing, as I always say. The forms that you use. First, I gave props for you in the Golden Shovel, but for your Lorenzo Thomas thing. Lorenzo Thomas was flitting around with the Umbra poets who don't really appear too much.
Tom from out of
Tom
New York.
Dent.
That's right, Tom Dent.
Tom Dent, Calvin Hurton.
Kalamu, he was a little after him. Kalamu Yasalam, behind him.
No, but he's in the index though.
Right.
But Steve Cannon and Amiri. That was Amiri's thing when when he left, and he didn't leave Greenwich Village either. Hetty still lives 1 block away from us, here.
Yeah.
So you got to call that.
It's anecdotally Greenwich to Harlem and what that means and who those two people are, Leroy Jones and
Laurie Side or the East Village would
that.
work as well and be a lot more accurate. Just saying.
Right. That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
So we've got the Lorenzo Thomas. You use a Kento for him. The titles you put together.
Because those lines of his, people again, like with him, that's kind of Yusuf too. But with Lorenzo, I almost had to do nothing. It was almost like he had just sent me that. Like I opened up my collected and saw the poem was just already there. It was just waiting. So that's him. Really, that's one of my favorite ones.
It's so good that you open the book and are finding it because you're leading us all in that direction. It's a nice direction.
That's all his lines.
Ekphrasis is a word that you rarely use, but you do the thing a lot. What does this piece remind you of? And then you have one of your famous drawing games for that kind of sestina. The sonnets, all your sonnets, your canto that you do for
David Berman.
For David Berman.
He's in both books. He's another one.
And Bill Knott makes an appearance in that.
Yeah.
Which
Bill
I
Knott,
love. I said, what's he doing here?
Yeah.
Come on in.
Bill Knott came out of Pitt, University of Pittsburgh Press.
Oh, that's right. Otto
Rest in peace, Ed O'Chester, the great. He was the editor for Etheridge and Sharon Olds and Bill Knott and Dean Young and Billy Collins, and Toy Derricott, Randy Manuel, Betsy Shaw. I mean, you can keep on going. David Wojan.
Go.
He just passed.
Well, Wojan, I didn't know that.
He was on Pitt, Mystery Train.
Well, see, that's, and he came from Lost Roads.
Right, yeah.
Wojan. A Gazald Sentence, which I love. That's one I want you to read. And then, of course, the Golden Shovel. Just to say that this man who seems like he's so spread so far, it must be thin. It ain't. It's got based in form. And, boy, I loved that canto for ghosts. But I think the ones I picked out for you here, if it's okay with you, was the American Sonnet and Golden Shovel and Woolworth and the Kafka virus, which we haven't even talked about how the Kafka virus, to me, is the COVID.
Yeah, that's what it is. The Woolworth is hard because of the voice, doing the voice.
But here it is. When you go phony euphony, you can't get away from two words, Terrance Hayes, without being a damn poet.
That's true.
You're always fooling with it. Ain't no lion. Ain't no lion. Oh, this is good. The one that's got the dog and the cat and all that.
Yeah.
There it is. Oh, this whole thing is a joke.
Right.
Woolworth, the whole thing is a joke, and it's got a punchline at the end.
Right.
But oh my goodness.
Which I didn't bring that one in here, because that's based on I think it's an Ashanti tale that buried inside of that joke is a whole other thing about things talk. I think that's the name of the Ashanti tale.
Page 48.
48. Oh, but I'm not going to read that one, though. You're not asking me.
You're not going to read that one.
Else.
If you want to read the American Sonnet. And then I always
sweat.
thought the Kafka virus verses maybe 10, but I don't know. Is that
one will make me sweat?
Okay, then you don't have to
sweat.
sweat.
I can do the
do the American Sonnet. That is just first is the Tree of Liberty. Where does that come from? The Tree of Liberty.
Well, this one is me. Can I say typically with my question of forms, I just don't really dwell on them too much. So
what?
To do the sonnet was the first time I was like, I'm just going to stick with this. But usually I just kind of turn to them in my course of writing. If I write 7 days a week, maybe one of the days I'm going to try out a sonnet or a haiku or something, and sometimes that becomes something. So I would say that as with form, obviously you should be working out in form just as an exercise, and sometimes those exercises become real. Here, though, at this point in my career, whatever number book this is, sometimes I'm deliberately playing with that idea that I can't go back to forms once I've done them. So certainly this is the first book that has a lot of overlapping forms, and this one is a golden shovel. So the golden shovel in this American sonnet, going down the line, is something from Thomas Jefferson. The tree of liberty must be refreshed with the blood of patriots and tyrants. That's what Thomas Jefferson said, which is great for all of his
revolution is the manure.
Yeah. And right now, if that's true, the tree of liberty must be refreshed with the blood of patriots and tyrants. That means all the Trump people, Trump and everybody who thinks that they're patriots, we got to refresh this country with. I know that sounds crazy. That's how they're thinking. They're thinking the same thing, that war is how to undo all the terrible things. And I'm like, it doesn't have to be, I don't mean like bloodshed, but I do mean like some kind of confrontation with people who are tyrants and so-called patriots, and what that means for us who are just like regular people trying to make sure it's an us and not a them. So this poem is sort of growing out of that. But that line is hidden in it, right? Like the poem, I think, is unpacking that and this notion of what the Constitution was written for, who it was written for. Were they really thinking about us when they wrote it? But that Thomas Jefferson line is in there. So this is the only time, all the lead into read this short poem, that I've actually very consciously, the only time that I've consciously said, I am going to take the American sonnet form and I'm going to take the golden shovel form and I'm going to mash them together and see what happens. As an exercise is really what it is. Okay, so here's the sonnet. Regarding my meditations and notes on the Constitution, constituted by a genealogical tree of white Christian merchants, of lawyers, of military men, of land and slave owners, penning liberty, not a true priest, nor farmer, nor artist, nor mustache among them, the laws constituted must naturally be intended to maintain, sustain, and occasionally refresh the power equal to freedom of people like them with little thought about others. Will you go to war with the appropriate weapon? Men armed with self-righteous blood will break you and laws very often. Make something of your suffering if you mean to survive it. Heroes and patriots are defined as those with a mind for sacrifice and a love for country when defined by fools and tyrants. So the fools and tyrants are telling us who the heroes and patriots are, and so we should not be listening.
That is,
yeah, I think it's all in there. I mean, again, this is one like, did I ever even send this poem out anywhere? But it definitely has. I didn't even need to say anything about it. I think it's saying everything I was trying to lead into about it. But this is certainly me thinking about Trump. All of those American sonnets, in some way or another, because they grew out of that period, to me still, even the ones in this book that are American sonnet from my past and future assassin, like the one with Nina Simone and Aretha Franklin doing a duet.
Oh,
that's him
goodness.
too. That's always him, because that still is very much where we are. I think even now, this question of that, whatever I think the American sonnet is always tied into things that are happening in terms of the democracy or the culture, I think. So not all the poems do that, but that's one of the signals, I think, in that form, which is to say, like with Wanda, it probably won't go away. It'll probably be the one form of all the forms I do that I feel like is always going to be necessary in a certain kind of climate. But otherwise, I just want to write my poems. I want to write poems about, old people jumping off of boats and, doormen, the miserable underground leagues of doormen. I do not want to be writing about Trump, but, he still is very much with us. And so I think that's particularly what that poem is doing. There's another sonnet in here that I just read the other day for the first time, and I would say, too, the sonnet where I was like, who is the opposite? What would be the opposite of Donald Trump's energy? Nelson Mandela. Not the Pope, not Queen Elizabeth, but like if you were like the opposite force, we just don't have that on the planet right now. So I do feel a little bit nostalgic too for a certain kind of voice that used to be equal to or even overwhelm the velocity and volume of a Trump voice. And I'm like, man, there is nothing to match that right now. Hence, when we're talking about like the Ukraine, like if there is no Trump, we have a lot more knowledge, a lot more stories, a lot more individual people, probably on both sides in the news, and a lot better understanding of that. But with Trump, he take up 80% of the news. So we get 20% of like, oh yeah, they dropped the bomb and some people died, and now we're back to whatever we're talking about with him. And man, that ain't good. That's how we've been living since 2016. And it's why we so closed off, we being people in America, so closed off from everything right now, because it's just so loud with this dude without saying anything else.
Well, he knows how to manipulate the media. He knows how to use this social
and
social
even
media.
If I'll take responsibility, because I be watching. I be on YouTube looking up stuff.
Here we are talking about.
I be watching MSNBC, so it ain't just them. I mean, I am tuning in because it is maybe more frightening to me than the Ukraine.
Yeah,
it shouldn't be, right? It should not be.
Oh, you got the bomb landed on your head, brother.
I'm telling you. But you know why I don't understand that? Because he's taking up the news cycle. Yeah. So I'm sort of saying, like, we still are very much in a moment where I feel sometimes I need to go home and write an American sonnet today. Like, book or no book, I still feel like the best way to articulate everything that I'm saying to you right now usually is for me to write a sonnet.
I think that's a perfect ending. Y'all hear that now. Yeah. So if you want to answer anything that's been said here, or anything that you got in your head, you heard the man, go out and write yourself a sonnet.
I'm going to go do that right now.
Thank you so much, Terrance Hayes.
I love you, Bob. You do so much. You've been here forever and influencing us in ways that we don't even always know. That's what I was saying about that United States of Poetry thing. I knew you were involved with it, but I just have never really had a chance to say, how important that thing was, and that it needs to. You could do it again. We could. I've thought that like 5 times over the last 20 years that we could do a whole other volume with that in the exact same way, in the same kind of like. People will call it MTV style, but it was literary. It was aesthetic. It was not
Mark
MTV.
Pellington, who did the directing, he really started the MTV
But it was
style.
Aesthetic, though. I think people thought that difference. It's like commercial. But those things were individual. Even Wanda's was really, so many of them, they were all really
Wanda's was really commercialized.
Get the
money.
That's what made me think about it.
Yes, she lives life in the black.
That's right. The one with the farmers and the woman's talking about it's like the cowboy poets.
Oh, yeah.
And is it Miguel too with the
HIV
the quarantine? Ooh, that's good. Yeah. So many good poems in there. Everything about it, visually, auditorily. Anyway, so I haven't had a chance to really say.
Well, you can watch it on Prime Video, folks. Go see it. It's only $4.
It's amazing. You can see some C.D. Wright. As I said, the Allen Ginsberg is so fun.
Alan said to my mother, "What's it like to have a son for a poet?"
That's right.
He always spoke up. We miss him too.
We do.
We
do a lot of. So we're glad to have that United States of Poetry, and it's more than that. It's definitely, we say with the Szczęść Miłość in there. We could have a couple more of those. So if you ever get in your mind and do that thing again,
I'd love to. Just get you funders out there. Come and see me immediately.
That's right. Thank you, Bob. That's what I'm saying to you, brother. We appreciate you.
Back at you. Beyond podcasts, you folks out there. I'm Bob Holman, and thank you for listening to Poetry is Bread. Subscribe to our podcast to get notifications of new episodes, or check us out at BoweryPoetry.com. The podcast is co-produced by Ram Devanini, Flavia Roja with Radaplax. Artwork by Fabian Ceroleo. This podcast series is funded by National Endowment for the Arts, New York State Council on the Arts, Governor of New York State, and the New York State Legislature. Keep listening.